Today, I have a whole bunch of Australian history books to share with you. Teaching Australian history as a homeschooler, it's kind of tough. Yeah, it's getting better and better with each year, and there are quite a lot of resources out there. But if we want something that's a little bit more dynamic, hands-on, interesting, realistic, telling at least some of the truths that happened in our country's past, then we really need to be cobbling our own course together ourselves, because there simply isn't one all fabulous encompassing product that does that for us. So we have to do it ourselves. Today though, I'm going to share with you 12 history books, which I think would make a great resource for those of you that are putting together your own history program. As you can see, I've got quite a pile of books to share with you today. So this video may be a slightly longer one, but what I will do is pop a bunch of timestamps in the description box below. Those timestamps are clickable so that you can skip through and find the particular book that you might be interested in. In saying that, each book in this stack is quite different from the others, so I would recommend that you try and carve out a bit of time to sit through and watch this entire video. And right at the end, I will share with you what my top choices out of this stack of Australian history books are. If you're new here, I'm Kylie, homeschool mom to 3, book lover and adventure seeker. We've been educating our children at home since 2007, so I hope you choose to stay around a while. Let's get into it, shall we? Okay, book number 1, The Australia Book by Eve Powell. So this book is a bit of an older book. It was originally published in 1952. So already that's an indication as to what you're going to find inside the book, given the age in which it was written. At 45 pages long, this collection is a general and brief overview of Australia's history. The opening page is dedicated to the first Australians, but as with most books written during this time, it quickly jumps into the era of early explorers. A heavily illustrated book, this would be great for the early primary years as a short introduction to Australia's history. Whilst the narrative addresses all major historical events, it mostly paints them in a positive light, which will be valuable for more sensitive children. Not all of our kids are ready for the harsh realities, and I understand that, and we each need to do what feels best for us and our families. So sometimes starting out with a book that will help a sensitive child ease into some of those not so great moments in our country's past can help with that. If you're seeking a more realistic and truthful representation of our history, you may want to seek out other resources to go along with this one. Okay, book number 2, Australian Kids Throughout the Years by Tanya McCartney. This one was first published in 2015. Whilst not a traditional Australian history book, this will be a great asset to any home library, and it's perfect for preschoolers through primary school. This is a brief timeline picture book depicting children and what it was like growing up in Australia during those years. This is a fun way for kids to see how things have changed over the years, from what we wear to the games kids played and the things that we did for work. So that is Australian Kids Through the Years. Book number 3 is the Australian History Collection by Bryce Courtney. This one was pulled together first as a collection in 2001. This is actually a series of short stories that have all been compiled together into this collection. And the 8 separate books that this collection holds within its covers are Captain Cook, The First Fleet, Bass and Flinders, Buckley's Chance, Crossing the Blue Mountains, Gold, Burke and Wills, Ned Kelly and his gang. So whilst far from a thorough account of our country's past, these highly illustrated narratives do provide a good brief overview of each topic that's included within the covers here. Plenty of colourful illustrations for younger readers, so it does make it inviting and exciting to look at. However, there is only a very brief mention of our First Nations people inside this particular one, so I'll leave that one up to you. Then we have the Upside Down History of Down Under. This one is by Alison Lloyd and the much loved illustrator Terry Denton, and it's a tiny little book, but it's a lot of pages. So it certainly has a lot of information in this book. And this one was published in 2018, so it's one of the more recent releases that we've had covering our country's past. I really enjoyed this book. It might be small, but gee, it packs a punch with the information that it includes. If your kids love horrible histories and that type of style, they'll surely love this particular book. And if you know Terry Denton and his illustration style, then you will absolutely love his simple, funny, candid, lovely illustrations that he's popped with inside the covers of this book. Alison Lloyd is to be commended on fitting in so much history into such a small book. Each section is simple, short, and to the point, giving the reader the need-to-know information. It begins all the way back in the time with Pangaea and includes some of Australia's most interesting megafauna. Several pages are dedicated to Indigenous Australians. With simple illustrations, the reader is kept engaged with the narrative. This book is also not afraid to tackle many of Australia's most questionable historical events. And I love that about this little book. And so whilst it's written for kids, I actually think it's a great read for everyone to get their hands on. It's a simple read, covers lots of information, and I think it's a great addition to our Australian history studies. Okay, book number 5, Our Sunburnt Country by Arthur Bailey. This book was originally published in 1964, so it is a little bit of an older book, although I do believe it has had a brief update to bring some of the elements into the present day. This is one of the original Australian history books for children, and it's undoubtedly still a valuable resource for young readers. Bailey describes the book as an easily read, short account of Australia's early history. This is a simple yet gentle introduction to Australia's past. The first chapter is dedicated to the dreaming, and with only brief mentions of our First Nations people throughout this narrative, it is most definitely a book of its time. But for primary and middle school age students, it's not a bad resource to have on hand, and I know that it is a popular narrative for Australian homeschoolers to use. The Big Book of Australian History by Peter McInnes. So this one was published in 2013. It is quite massive. 280 oversized pages inside the cover of this particular book. It is filled with stacks of photographs and loads of information, and it certainly provides the reader with a vast amount of details. I think this one is a great choice for older kids and anyone hungry for historical narratives. Check it out. Okay, book number 7, The Story of Australia by Robert Lewis. This one was published in 2017, so it's a relatively fresh account as well. By the way, I will pop links to all of these books in the description box below. So if you're watching this on a mobile, just turn your phone to portrait mode, click the drop down arrow so the description box opens up, and you'll be able to see direct links to each one of these books for you to have a closer look at. Okay, so this one is another brim-filled account with some truly wonderful photographs throughout. As I read through this edition, I did quickly realise that this spine, I believe, is pretty much on equal footing with the book I just mentioned before, the Big Book of Australian History. So I think either or of those books, this one or this one, would make a great spine to base some of your history studies from. Then we have The Story of Australia by Don Watson. And straight away you can tell by looking at this that this is an older find, and it was a lucky secondhand book find for me. This one was published in 1984, so it's actually not the oldest book I have in the pile, even though it probably looks like it is. And so yeah, whilst it is slightly older, I think at the time, it definitely would have been ahead of its time with just some of the information that it includes here and some of the topics that it's not afraid to tackle. I think this would have been an excellent read back in 1984, and I still think it is today. It's got some fascinating images and some fascinating photography inside the pages. I think this is a great one to simply sit and thumb through, stopping along the way to read sections that pique one's interest. So this one begins with an ancient Australia, some 500 million years ago. It dedicates several pages to life on our land before white settlement. Don Watson is also not afraid, as I said before, to tackle topics such as Captain Cook did not discover Australia, how our First Nations people were outcasts on their own land, including the massacre at Mile Creek, life on Aboriginal reserves and the treatment of the Kanakas, And if you've never heard of the Kanakas and don't believe that slavery never ever existed here in Australia, do yourself a favour and start doing some research on that one. So while some of this book, I do agree it needs updating, but if you can get your hands on a copy of it, I don't think you'll be disappointed. Okay, another popular one in homeschooling circles is the Ashton Scholastic History of Australia by Manning Clark. This particular book was first published in 1988. I do believe it's had a few updates and it is widely used in schools. As an Ashton Scholastic publication, this is quite clearly written to be used in a school-based setting for upper primary and high school students, with illustrations on every page, and its introduction beginning with the Earth's crust, moving into today's position some 40 to 50 million years ago. This narrative briefly covers Australia and its inhabitants before European exploration. So in the chapter entitled Soon No Black Men, that does discuss some of the difficulty in which our Indigenous Australians encountered with early Europeans. Book number 10, Australians All by Nadia Wheatley. First published in 2013. This one's a little on the pricey side. It's certainly not a cheap book by any means. I think I paid close to $50 for this particular book. But I have to say I adore the way in which Wheatley has chosen to tackle telling Australia's past through stories of the children and young people that live through those moments in time. And the dust jacket of this one explains it perfectly well. Australians All encompasses the history of our continent, from the Ice Age to the Apology, from the arrival of the First Fleet to the Mabo Judgment. Brief accounts of the lives of real young Australians open up this chronological narrative. Some of the subjects of these 80 mini-biographies have become nationally or even internationally famous. Others were legends in their own families and communities. This is without a doubt an Australian history book that is worthy of being on all of our bookshelves. And I think it's one that would make a great, interesting and really varied study of our history. Okay, book number 11, Our Australian Story by Jeanette Cassie Ingham. This book has been researched, written and illustrated all by Jeanette. And her inspiration for this book was her own children. I love that. I love that about this. It was Jeanette's desire to share Australian history with her own children and having no such resource to do so. This snippet on her website best describes the book. This big A4 sized book is a journey through Australian history, discovering the stories of the people and the places of early colonial history. You will rediscover your country and find out what really happened. Not just the cold hard facts, but the stories of the people and places behind them. What life was like and how much has changed. The discoveries, the many Aboriginal people living all over the land. Meeting the Maori people too and visiting New Zealand. The hard journeys across Australia. The struggles, building the colonies, how the country was run, the dramas, the triumphs and the tragedies. The humour too. The things that grew out of it to make Australia Australian. Then we have Young Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. This one was published in 2019. This is the junior version of the award-winning Dark Emu. Pascoe sets out to explain that not only were Australian Aboriginals hunter-gatherers at the time of British colonisation, but yet they were also people that built villages and made agricultural use of their land. This is in stark contrast to the history we've been previously told. Young Dark Emu is an interesting read, sharing of our native flora and fauna, our people, and their immense struggles with Europeans. Okay, so as you can see, we're not doing too badly with our choices currently today for Australian history spines to work through with our children. I find it really encouraging to see more and more folks taking the plunge into researching and writing more accurate accounts of our country's past, and doing that for our kids, putting together that quality information so that our children are taught a more accurate representation of history. Okay, so my top choices from this pile today are the Young Dark Emu, the Upside Down History of Australia, and the Big Book of Australian History. And if for some reason you can't get your hands on this one, then the Story of Australia is also not a bad choice here. So have you guys got anything else that you'd like to add to this pile of Australian history spines? Something that you found an amazing resource that I may not have stumbled across? Please let me know, because as you can see, I like collecting Australian history resources. So if there is something that you've got, please pop it in the comments below. Also, this is my first Australian specific homeschooling video. So I'm going to create a playlist on my YouTube channel, and as I do more Aussie homeschool videos, I will continue to add them to that playlist. So anyway, thank you so much for being here with me today. Don't forget, if you haven't subscribed yet, please pop on over and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you all again sometime soon. Bye for now.